Mr. Cox, question for you. Are we missing the forest for the trees here? Why not focus on prosecuting the websites that can be considered content providers for knowing facilitation of prostitution, which seems to be more readily provable as an offense? And why not increase criminal exposure there? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right that, first of all, we can use the federal tools that Congress recently provided, as I mentioned, the SAVE Act. There is a great deal of emotion that's brought to this. There's a lot of energy. The country is ready to move on this, and yet here's the federal government with all these tools, and not one single prosecution has been brought by the Department of Justice anywhere in the United States on sex trafficking using the SAVE Act, which was recently signed into law. I've proposed additional legislation that's attached to my testimony. In the Kennedy administration, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, decided that state governments and state attorneys general needed help in going after organized crime that crossed state borders and so on, and we got the Travel Act. And the Travel Act expressly covers prostitution. What it doesn't expressly cover is sex trafficking, but prostitution and sex trafficking are obviously closely related. By amending the Travel Act in ways that I have proposed, and by including penalties in there that can go up to life in prison, I think we can make it pretty clear that we're serious about this, and we can bring prosecutions that are once completed for victims to get restitution so that they don't have to file their own civil suits. I've attached, as I say, a proposed draft of such legislation as an exhibit to my testimony.
Thank you for that. Mr. Kosseff, do you agree with Mr. Cox that there may be potential adverse effects of putting carve-outs into the CDA 230, and could a carve-out be preferable in some ways?
I do. I've thought a lot about what the carve-outs would look like, and not just for sex trafficking, but for other emerging threats that are very serious, such as terrorist use of social media, and who knows what the next threat will be 5 years down the road. So I think that's why we have to be very careful about how we do these carve-outs. That's not to say we can't do it, but I think that it does set a precedent, and very well it might be necessary, but we just do have to be aware of that risk.
Mr. Engstrom, what kinds of changes would you suggest in any pending legislation to assure startup companies are sufficiently protected and allowed to grow?
So I think the first one we talked about a little bit before. Thank you for the question. It's clarifying what types of laws state authorities can bring. We want to ensure that there aren't conflicting standards. We want to make sure that laws that are passed don't create impossible burdens or disrupt how the internet functions. It's not a hypothetical threat. We've seen in, I think, 24 states proposals to have mandated anti-pornography filters on devices. Doesn't exist, it can't work. That bill is designed to prevent human trafficking, so it could potentially fit under a reading of the statute. I think we can clarify that. The second piece is how we define knowledge. We don't want to sweep in people that don't actually know of what's happening on their sites, and we want to encourage them to take the positive, proactive steps of identifying and remediating this type of content. So I think you need to clarify it to make sure it's going after the bad actors who have awareness of this activity but aren't responding to it, as opposed to those startups that are doing the right thing, trying to do the right thing, but by virtue of how this content looks online, maybe not visibly, immediately recognizable as such, puts them in a position where they don't know how to act.
Is there a template or a model already in federal statutes on that knowledge aspect?
Yeah, so you can look at mirrors in other types of the law. So for example, in like the copyright context, the DMCA, you have a notice and takedown provision where there's a clear way to provide a platform with knowledge and clear guidelines on how they're meant to respond. In the child exploitation context, you have very clear guidelines on who you're supposed to notify. I think these laws have language, particularly in the copyright context, that has been the source of considerable litigation over what knowledge means. So I think we need to take those lessons and apply them here and make sure we're crafting knowledge in a very clear way that gets at bad actors and not honest startups.